Have you ever thought about booking your dream solo trip, but then immediately your brain goes, okay, but what if I panic? What if I'm in another country all by myself and suddenly my anxiety gets really bad? What if I can't calm myself down? What if I need help and don't know where to go? Or even, what if I have to come home early and I waste all of this money and time? Because honestly, as someone with anxiety, that was probably one of my biggest fears before I started traveling solo. And maybe it's yours too. Maybe the idea of experiencing your anxiety somewhere unfamiliar feels 10 times scarier than being anxious at home. Because at home you know what to do, where your safe places are, or who you'd call. But abroad that feels totally different. Or at least, that's what our brains tell us. So today I want to talk about my plan for travelling with anxiety, and the actual things I do that help me feel okay enough to keep seeing the world anyway. Welcome to The Anxious Solo Female Traveller, the podcast for women who dream of travelling solo, but anxiety, overthinking, or a million what-ifs have held them back. I'm Katie, and over the last 5 years, I've travelled to 24 countries solo, with my anxiety and social anxiety along for the ride. And no, solo travel didn't magically cure me. I still overthink, I still get anxious, I still have many moments where I wonder why on earth I booked the trip in the first place. But I go anyway. And honestly, I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. So today, let's talk about one of the biggest fears of all. What if I panic abroad? Okay, so here's something I realised a few years into travelling solo that completely changed how I thought about this. I wasn't actually scared of the panic itself. I was scared of being anxious somewhere unfamiliar. Because if you've ever struggled with anxiety before, you've probably already had anxious spirals at home. I know I definitely have. And when you're at home, even if it feels horrible, there's still this sense of, okay, I know what to do here. I know where my comfort things are, I know who I call, I know which routines help me feel better. I know that eventually this feeling will pass. But when you imagine the exact same thing happening in another country, suddenly your brain goes into full disaster mode. So what if I need help? What if I can't make myself feel better? What if I need to come home? And honestly, before my first solo trip, I imagined every possible worst-case scenario. My brain was seriously working overtime. And I was convinced that I'd have a panic attack at the airport, or on the train, or sitting in a restaurant. Honestly, anywhere and everywhere. And I think that what made it feel so scary wasn't the anxiety itself, but the idea of being alone with it. Because being anxious somewhere familiar feels more manageable. Yet being anxious somewhere unfamiliar feels impossible. Or at least that's what my brain was telling me. But here's what I've learned through many moments of panic on the road over the last 5 years. You're still you, and you still have all the same coping skills. You still know how to get through hard moments. The location changes, sure, but you don't suddenly lose everything you've already learned about yourself. And honestly, I think that's really important to remember. Now, before I say anything else, I do just want to say that this isn't medical advice. This is just what I've learned from living with my own anxiety for years and then taking that anxiety travelling with me. And something that's helped me is understanding that panic feels dangerous, but isn't actually. And believe me, I know that is much easier said than believed, especially when you're in the middle of it. Because feeling panicked is horrible and scary, and your brain convinces you that something awful is happening. Or at least that it's about to happen. And in that moment, it feels completely real. But here's what I always remind myself. Anxiety has a 100% track record of convincing me that this time is different. But also, it has a 100% failure rate at actually being right. So every single time, every single anxious spiral, every single moment where I've thought, no, but seriously, this time, it feels different. It feels real. This time I genuinely can't cope. I've got through it. Every single one. And I don't say that to minimize the experience at all. I say it because I know it to be true. On a logical level, at least. Even if I don't always believe it to be true in the moment. I know that I have come through every anxious day or panicked moment I've ever had. And if you're listening to this now, so have you. Which is actually pretty incredible when you think about it. And I think sometimes we forget that. We give our anxiety all the credit in the world, but We never give ourselves credit for handling it. And over the years, I've realized that when I start feeling really overwhelmed, I don't actually need some magical solution. I just need to go back to basics. So for me, that's sit down somewhere, drink some water or get a snack, text or call somebody I trust. And honestly, stop trying to breathe perfectly. I don't know if anyone else does this, but when somebody tells me to focus on my breathing, I suddenly become incredibly bad at breathing. Like I've forgotten how lungs even work. Maybe that's just me. But now I just let myself breathe naturally. No pressure, no counting, or trying to fix anything. And I try to remind myself, even though it's one of the most difficult things to do in the moment, that this is uncomfortable, but it isn't dangerous. That this feels horrible, but it will pass. Because it always has before. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest mindset shifts that I've had around anxiety and travel. And it's helped me honestly both at home and abroad. The goal isn't to never feel anxious, because that's impossible. It's trusting that if anxiety shows up, I already know how to handle it, because I've been practicing my whole life. Okay, so let's talk about the actual plan I have in place whenever I solo travel. And again, this is just my experience and what helps me and not medical advice. But for me, I think that one of the biggest things that helps isn't actually certainty, which I think may be an unpopular opinion because anxiety loves certainty. But true certainty is also not possible, travelling or not. So the next best thing? Having a plan. I don't need to know that absolutely nothing bad will happen. Because again, let's be real, none of us can know that. I just need to trust that if something does happen, I know what I'm going to do. So before I even leave for a trip, there are a few little things I always do. So I save emergency contacts and the local emergency phone number in my phone. I download offline Google Maps so that if mobile data ever fails me, I can still get around. I make sure I know the address of my hotel and physically write it down, just in case anything happens to my phone. I always get travel insurance, no matter how long my trip is or where I'm going. And I pack my comfort items on every single trip. So for me, that's things like my noise-cancelling headphones. They're incredibly useful for shutting out the world for a while. For example, on public transport, if you feel overstimulated or you just need to relax without the constant background noise. A good book downloaded on my Kindle is another essential. And a small puzzle book to distract my mind if I spiral. I think this is so underrated but so helpful. And honestly, all of those things sound really small, but they help more than you could believe. But aside from the things I pack, I also know that if my anxiety does spiral when I'm travelling, I have a simple plan to fall back on. Step 1 is to find somewhere that feels safe. And that doesn't have to be your hotel room. So it could be a cafe, or finding a quiet spot in a museum you're visiting. Sitting on a park bench if that feels safe. Literally anywhere that feels calm and comfortable to you. Because the worst thing we can do when we're feeling anxious or panicky is to keep forcing ourselves forward, to carry on sightseeing when we're already overwhelmed. My step 2 is to remove the pressure. So, like I said, you do not have to continue sightseeing. You do not need to make every single second of your day productive. And I think sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves when we travel. Especially if it's a short trip, we think, well, I've paid for this. I've used paid time off for this. I have to keep going. I have to see everything, and I have to make the most of it. But honestly, no you don't. If what you need is to sit in a cafe for an hour with a hot chocolate and absolutely zero plans, that's still travelling. That's still a good day, and that's still more than enough. Step 3 is probably the biggest thing I've learned over the years, and it's to use exactly the same tools you'd use at home. Because anxiety abroad is still anxiety. It doesn't suddenly become some brand new thing just because you're in Italy, or Iceland, or Montenegro. It's the same anxiety you've always had, just, hopefully, with a prettier view. And honestly, I think that's really comforting, because it means all the things that help you at home can help you abroad too. So if going for a walk helps, do that. If sitting quietly with a cup of tea helps, do that. If listening to music helps, again, do that. You don't need some special travel version of coping with anxiety. You already know yourself better than anyone else. And step 4 is to call somebody. And I know this sounds obvious, but I think when we're anxious, we convince ourselves that we have to handle everything alone because we're travelling alone. Or that admitting we're anxious and need support is somehow admitting failure. But that's just not true. Travelling solo doesn't mean doing life solo. I mean, I'm an adult woman and yet I have absolutely called my mum in the middle of the day just because I need to hear a familiar voice. And honestly, sometimes a 10-minute conversation is enough to remind you that your world is still your world. So home still exists, and your people are still there, and that you are okay. And then the final step is remembering something that I think about all the time when I travel. Nothing lasts forever. So not the good moments, not the difficult ones, not the anxiety, not the loneliness, not the homesickness. Literally everything passes. And I think that you can look at it two ways, but I choose to look at it as incredibly comforting. Because even if you did have a horrible hour or a difficult afternoon, that doesn't mean the entire trip is ruined. It just means that you had a hard moment, and hard moments are part of it all, whether you're at home or halfway across Europe. Honestly, I don't travel because I'm certain that nothing bad will ever happen. I travel because I now trust myself to handle it if it does. And as I said in the last episode, I think that that's a much more realistic kind of confidence to have. Now, I want to be really honest about something too, because I have absolutely spiraled abroad and I've panicked loads of times. And yet, I've still had some of the best experiences of my life. I remember when I went to Iceland on my own a couple of years ago, and I was so excited about that trip. It had been on my bucket list for years to visit in winter and see the northern lights and take photos in the snow. And yet, on that trip, I had so many moments of panic. My flight out got cancelled as I was just about to arrive at Gatwick Airport due to bad weather at Keflavik, and that spiked my panic to the extent that I actually took myself all the way home, which is about 2 hours, so that I could deal with it somewhere I felt safe. Long story short, I rebooked a flight for the next morning, had to pay for an incredibly expensive last-minute airport hotel, and then took myself all the way back to Gatwick. Then, during the trip, my beloved and very expensive DSLR camera broke, and again, I was devastated. My brain convinced me that it was some sort of disaster, but I got myself back to the hotel room, allowed myself time to feel my feelings, which basically translate as crying on my bed. And then I went through quick fixes online until I found one that allowed my much-loved Canon to at least get me through the rest of my trip. I also spiraled when I learned that the driver of my Northern Lights tour couldn't get through to drop me back at my hotel, so I had to walk through the streets of Reykjavik alone at 3 a.m. I took some deep breaths, had my personal safety alarm in my hand, and thanked my lucky stars, honestly, for Iceland being the safest country in the world, because, yeah, it would have felt a lot worse being literally anywhere else. And those are just some of the moments where I felt completely overwhelmed on that trip, where I questioned whether I'd made the right decision even coming, where I wanted to go home. But did that mean that trip to Iceland was bad? Absolutely not. I mean, it might not sound like it, but it was actually one of the best things I've ever done. Because I also saw waterfalls that took my breath away. I watched the most incredible sunrise over the tectonic plates of the Golden Circle. And even though those moments felt huge at the time, the anxiety was only one tiny part of a much bigger experience. And even though I'm telling you these stories now, those moments are the last thing I remember when I look back on that trip. And I think that's something we forget, because sometimes we think that one bad hour means a bad trip. But that's never been true for me. I've felt lonely in beautiful places, and I've had moments where social anxiety has meant that I can't do something. And I've had days where I just needed to slow down and do absolutely nothing. And honestly, that didn't ruin the trip either. It was just what I needed that day. Because anxiety gets to come with me. It just doesn't get to decide what I do, where I go, what I experience, or what memories I make. It's there, often louder than I'd like it to be, honestly. But it isn't in charge. And I think that that's been one of the biggest lessons that solo travel has taught me. So before we wrap up this episode, I want to give you one really simple thing to do this week. I want you to create your own panic plan. Open your notes app, grab a notebook, whatever works for you, and ask yourself, what helps me when I'm anxious at home? Who would I call? What comforts me? What helps me feel grounded? What do I need somebody to say to me in that moment? So my list would look something like drink some water or have something to eat. Go somewhere quiet and safe. Put my headphones on. Remind myself that this feeling will pass. And take the pressure off. Whatever works for you is the right answer. Because the thing about doing this now is that you don't have to figure it out in the middle of a spiral. You can make those decisions while you're calm, while you're thinking clearly, and then, if anxiety does show up when you're travelling, you've already got a plan waiting for you. And a plan doesn't guarantee that anxiety won't show up. Nothing can do that. It just reminds you that if it does, you already know what to do. So if the fear of panicking abroad has been the thing stopping you from solo travelling, I want you to remember that you have survived every anxious day you've ever had. Every moment of panic, every spiral, and every time you thought you couldn't cope. And if anxiety comes with you on your solo trip, you'd get through that too. Because you've already been practicing how to handle anxiety your entire life. The skills you use at home don't disappear when you get on a plane. They come with you. And honestly, I think that's something really comforting to remember. Because the version of you sitting at home worrying about what might happen abroad is exactly the same person who survived every difficult moment life has already thrown at her. And I think she deserves a little more credit for that. And if you're sitting here thinking, okay, maybe I could actually do this, but I still don't know where to start, I've put together a completely free email course called 7 Days to Your First Solo Trip, Even If You're Anxious. It's basically the step-by-step guide I wish somebody had given me before I booked my first solo trip. I'll leave the link in the show notes or in the description if you're on YouTube, if you'd like to join. And next week, we're talking about another big topic. I want to travel solo, but I'm scared. Where do I actually start? Because often the hardest part isn't the trip itself. It's knowing what first step to take and having the confidence to take it. So if that sounds helpful, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you next week.